Now that the player bios are out of the way, I wanted to cover a few more moments relating to Lombardi's family and his assistant coaches and their transitions to Green Bay. One of the problems about doing so much research is even though you try to go in chronological order by only reading sources that cover a specific time period, this strategy will inevitably still lead to some backtracking, as they will often mention one interesting thing that took place months before the rest of the interview or article. For example, let's say I want to cover what happened in August of 1959, so I only look at the information that covers that specific period. If I pick 6 sources, there's a good chance that at least 2 of them will still mention things from months earlier, and sometimes these can be interesting bits of knowledge you either haven't heard before, or if they do cover an event you already know about, then it'll give you much more detail. Even if I waited until I was at the end of 1959, I still wouldn't be completely free of this problem. For example, I could be covering the year 1961 and thinking I'm home free of backtracking, and then a player or coach will happen to mention something from 1959, and once again, I have to return to that year. Ultimately, this is a very good problem to have if you want the most definitive documentary ever on this first season. However, while I am in the process of doing this, I have to admit it can be a bit frustrating that the pre-existing first-hand sources aren't ordered as well as they could be. So let's backtrack a bit, and then in the second half of this video, we'll cover the start of the first full day of training camp. That will be done in this episode, so no worries. Actual football will be covered. As documented in part 2, the first impression of Lombardi's family wasn't that enthusiastic, as his wife, despite what she may have told the press, didn't seem to want to move, and her daughter Susan, in her own words, recounted that she started feeling depressed. On Monday morning, after the family first moved there, Susan started attending St. Matthew's parochial school, while Vincent Jr. would go to Green Bay, Vermont, an all-male Catholic institution. The first day there, he recounted that he could sense 1,000 heads turn and 2,000 eyes. The paper had hyped him up as being 6'2" and 210 pounds, despite him being about 3 inches shorter and 30 pounds lighter, showing that back then it was easier to get away with inaccurate information that demonstrably false. At the Green Bay office, Lombardi supposedly told his new secretary, Ruth McCloskey, that the condition of the building was a disgrace, so just 1 month later, renovations would be made. One of the changes that would take place would be in his own private office, where he put up tan burlap wallpaper that was a bit ugly, to be polite. Just so you have a mental image of what it may have looked like, here's a roll of burlap fabric. Now, just imagine that covering an entire office. McCloskey remembers, "I almost died when they were putting it up because it was in great big rolls and lint was flying all over the room. The men putting it up were groaning the whole time. When Mrs. Lombardi finally came in, she said, 'Who in the world thought of this?' Mr. Lombardi was kind of sheepish about it. He thought it looked mannish." For Lombardi's assistant coaches, he put them through an interview process where he quizzed them on their football knowledge, going over things such as the sweep, the option, the trap, audibles, rule blocking, the 4-3 defense, and man-on-man coverage. Fred Cochran, who had coached the offensive backfield, had his own interview at the Willow Run Airport in Detroit, while Lombardi was changing planes from New York to Green Bay. Cochran had come from the Lions, so presumably that's why the interview had been done there in what would appear to be a haphazard way. And in terms of what type of pay the assistant coaches got, here's an official Green Bay Packers check that was written out to Phil Bingston on June the 15th, 1959, to the order of $429.30. It was signed by Dominic Olenichek and Lombardi, and the check came from the Kellogg Citizens National Bank. Now, was this check made out every 2 weeks or just once a month? I couldn't find information on that. However, just a year prior, in 1958, the Green Bay Packers had spent a total of $85,658.03 on coaching, scouting, and publicity. So if you assume the finances of the Packers for 1959 were similar, then you have to take a figure around $85,000 and divide that up between Lombardi, all of his assistants, and the scouts. Based on this Lombardi check, which is dated at the end of the month, I'm inclined to believe Bingston was paid twice a month. Assistant coaches back then would have second jobs during the off-season, and I wasn't able to find any word if Bingston would have been paid this amount every single month out of the year. So if I had to make a wild guess based on the $85,000 figure and how big of a chunk Lombardi was getting that almost cut that figure in half, combined with the assumption Bingston would have been paid more than the players, I would say he may have made somewhere between $7,000 and $10,000 a year, with that figure possibly being right in the middle, but it could be wrong. Moving on the night before Lombardi's first meeting with the executive board, he went over his contract again with McCloskey, where he had her get rid of sections of the contract he didn't like. McCloskey recalled, "One that I distinctly remember him crossing out is a paragraph that he couldn't drink in public places. That was in the contract originally, and Mr. Lombardi said, 'No one's going to tell me where I'm going to drink.'" Red Cochran recalls his memories on Lombardi in those early meetings of 1959. "We knew Lombardi was going to be disciplined because he started us on day one. Every day events took a certain amount of time that we sat down and went through football just like we were learning it for the first time. He was on the blackboard teaching us with the same techniques that we would eventually use with players. He told us what plays we were going to run, how they were going to be blocked. We were making up our own notebooks at the time, putting all the plays in cards like he had, 8.5 by 11-inch notebook cards with holes in them, just like his Bible." In regard to Paul Hornung, the moment Lombardi supposedly decided he would be his halfback came when he was watching game film with assistant coach Bill Austin, who was operating the projector. Lombardi saw one impressive run and yelled to Austin, "Run that play again." He later said, "That's my offense." The very next day, Lombardi called Hornung. "I want you to know one thing. You're not going to be my quarterback. Your quarterback days are over. You won't have to worry about playing 3 positions anymore. You're my left halfback. You're my Frank Gifford. You're either going to be my left halfback or you're not going to make it in pro football." With Bart Starr, his future was less certain. Bingston described him as adequate as a backup. Lombardi said, "We've got a hell of a problem. We got to find somebody who can move this club." As talked about in the start of this documentary, Billy Houghton, the famed receiver of the Packers in the 1950s, would get traded away. Well, Gary Knafleck, who was friends with Houghton before the trade, offers some insight as to why the Packers didn't keep him. Back in February of 1959, Houghton called up Knafleck. Houghton said, "Vince called me." Knafleck responded, "Wait a minute, Billy. I sure wouldn't call him Vince." Knafleck had already met Lombardi in the stands of a minor league hockey game and was struck by his stern demeanor. Houghton, however, seemed to ignore the advice against calling Lombardi by his first name. He said he was going to fly up to Green Bay to meet with Vince, and he wanted Knafleck to pick him up at the airport. Knafleck responded once more, "Billy, I'm going to tell you again, I would not call him Vince." So Knafleck picked him up from the airport, and he remembered the quickness of the meeting. So I dropped him off, and my wife had some errands for me to run at Pranks. I went there, I got back home, and my wife says, "Bill wants you to pick him up right away. He's got to get back to Dallas." And I say, "I just dropped him off." And she says, "Well, he's waiting for you." So I drove down to the office in Washington Street, and he's standing on the corner and gets in, and he's silent. And I say, "What happened?" And he says nothing, and wouldn't talk about it anymore. Lombardi, of course, would trade Houghton to the Browns for halfback Luke Carpenter and defensive end Bill Quinlan. Now, as to what spurred this trade is not 100% clear. Knafleck's story seems to imply that Houghton's flippant attitude helped to end things. However, this may have been something Lombardi was planning to do anyway, as he knew he had to tighten up the defense. And on the matter of calling Lombardi by his first name, Frank Gifford of the Giants also did this, and they had a good relationship. However, that situation was a bit different, as Lombardi was an assistant coach who wasn't established in the NFL yet when the two first met. Houghton, however, was addressing a new head coach he didn't know. However, we're not privy to what was specifically said in the conversation, and maybe Houghton was respectful and refrained from calling him Vince. According to Bart Starr, the meeting was around 30 minutes long, so maybe Lombardi didn't absolutely have his mind made up yet, but who knows. In Lombardi's first week or so in town, he stunned his son when he asked him if he wanted to go to a hockey game. Evidently, he wasn't used to seeing his father be this spontaneous. And as an aside, this could have possibly been the same hockey game where Knafleck first met Lombardi, although it's not clear. On the way to the game, Lombardi picked up 2 hitchhikers, another thing Lombardi wouldn't normally do, and one of them would end up becoming Vince Jr.'s friend at school. In spite of the difficulty of being a new head coach and general manager, Lombardi had bouts of excitement and positive energy, which manifested in ways his son wasn't used to seeing. At the same time, however, he could also demonstrate a great deal of stress. According to McCloskey, she found him late one afternoon in his chair with his head in his hands. She asked him what was wrong. He said, "I think I've taken on more than I can handle. Will you pray for me and help me?" If this account is accurate, then it shows his mood and self-confidence that first year were going up and down. Now that some additional notes on the first few months are out of the way, let's skip ahead to the summer quarterback class. As noted by Bart Starr, one of the things that was striking in the differences between former coach McLean and his new coach was how much smaller Lombardi's playbook was. McLean's list of plays was based off of Clark Sinus's system and was more than 4 inches thick and was complicated. Lombardi's, however, was 1.5 inches and clear, easy, and efficient. Under the Packers' old system, the play calls were long and difficult to learn, such as 49 below Grace Ed, which was an end sweep. With the new regime, all the quarterback had to say was 49. The 4 was the formation, and 9 was the hole the running back was supposed to hit. Lombardi would not only explain what to do, but why he wanted it done. Lombardi elaborated. They call it coaching, but it is teaching. You do not just tell them it is so, but you show them the reasons why it is so, and you repeat and repeat until they are convinced, until they know. On Thursday, July 23rd, Lombardi greeted the rookies in front of St. Norbert's Sensenbrenner Hall. There was, however, an awkward moment when he mistook one of the rookies, Billy Butler, for a kid. "What the hell are you doing here? This line isn't for kids." Butler replied, "Well, you drafted me. Ain't I supposed to show up?" Butler, a back from Chattanooga, had been selected by Jack Venisi, and he would be one of the few rookies to end up making the team. For 1959, he would mostly be used for kickoff and punt returns, and he would return one of those punts for a touchdown. However, this season would be his first and only for the Packers, and then next year he would be sent off to Dallas. Butler looked back. "Lombardi was the biggest I ever met in my life." July 25th. Remember how I mentioned that Jerry Kramer and Joe Francis had showed up to camp early? Well, they weren't the only ones. Receiver Max McGee and fullback Howie Ferguson arrived in town on Friday and went to St. Norbert's to get lunch. They ate with the rookies and hit the bars, then crashed at a hotel before checking into camp the next day. This was unacceptable to Lombardi, so he was there to greet McGee and Ferguson to chew them out. Ferguson shot back, "What the hell? We're not due till today." That didn't matter. By having lunch there on Friday, they had, under Lombardi's rules, officially checked in, so choosing to leave was tantamount to skipping camp. Lombardi said, "Once you do that, you're part of this organization." McGee backed down, but Ferguson was still upset, and not surprisingly, he would soon be gone, although in a roundabout way, as he would be sent to the Steelers before immediately being sent back to Green Bay. However, an injury would prevent him from doing anything, and in 1960, he finished off his career with the Chargers of the AFL. Tackle Forrest Gregg also remembered his first experience. He, like the others mentioned, also traveled to Green Bay early, so evidently this was normal behavior for the team. Gregg opted to go with defensive back John Semink. Anyway, Semink called up defensive tackle Dave Hanner to see how things were going. It turns out Hanner had already been sent to the hospital for dehydration. Hanner said, "You won't believe it. He's working our rear ends off." So that's a story Forrest Gregg tells. However, Hanner was not a rookie in 1959, and most of the veterans weren't due to camp until later. However, as noted previously, some veterans did attend early, so it's possible he was an exception. Regardless of when Hanner's collapse took place, Bart Starr remembered that Hanner ended up staying at the hospital for 2 days. During next year's training camp, to mess with them, the team presented Hanner with a certificate for 2 days room and board at a hospital of his choice. So now we are finally getting to the beginning of the full training camp. July 26, 1959. This takes us to that Sunday when he first talked to the entire team. He began by covering the playbooks. Practices would be an hour and a half twice a day. Everyone would show up 10 minutes early to each meeting, so 9 o'clock, for example, would mean 8:50. Lombardi addressed them. With every fiber of my body, I've got to make you the best football player that I can make you. And I'll try, and I'll try. And if I don't succeed the first day, I'll try again, and I'll try again. And you've got to give everything that is in you. You got to keep yourself in prime physical condition because fatigue makes cowards of us all. Players would also have to dress professionally, namely team blazers and ties, as shown in this photo. Wherever you go, you represent the team. You will talk like, you will look like, and you will act like the most dignified professional in your hometown. Anyone who didn't like his new system knew what to do. There are trains, planes, and buses leaving here every day, and if you don't produce for me, you're going to find yourself on one of them. After the speech was over, as the players were leaving, Lombardi motioned for McGee to come to him. McGee walked over and Lombardi said, "What you think?" McGee replied, "Well, I'll tell you, you got their attention, coach. There's no doubt about that." Lombardi answered, "You know, I wasn't sure. Everybody could have gotten up and walked out for all I knew." July 27th. The Packers rookie scrimmaged at the Oneida Street Drill Grounds in front of around 500 people. It was also noted that Bob Webb shined at quarterback, where he would handle all snaps from scrimmage and completed around 15 passes. Despite this, Webb would not end up making the team. The workouts in camp would begin with 3 laps around the goalposts, then 20 minutes of calisthenics, and they would end up running in place. Vince Jr. was there to witness it all. He served as the ball and water boy. However, Vince Jr. wasn't one to tell on players, as Emlyn Tunnell observed. Despite being the son of Lombardi, he could be trusted. On his first full day of training camp, Lombardi wrote he had mixed feelings about being seen as tough. The reasoning behind his approach and always maintaining this attitude was that success was supposed to be a habit. You had to constantly work to achieve it, and the second you let up, that would be when you fail. It was a constant grind, and any sign that a player was becoming complacent had to be dealt with immediately. After that first day, Lombardi said he almost wanted to cry. There was a lackadaisical energy the whole team seemed to possess. It was almost as if they were going through the motions, and this attitude had spread through the team like a virus. The next day, Lombardi saw almost 20 players in the trainer's room trying to get physical therapy, and it's here that he blew up. He yelled, "What is this? An emergency casualty ward?" He went on to say when players are really hurt, they had a right to be here, but for minor things, they were going to have to learn to work through it if they were going to play for him. The next day, there were only 2 players in that room. Lombardi wrote that he tried to make offensive linemen's jobs easier by using option blocking and rule blocking. With option blocking, instead of just locking up with a defensive lineman, the blocker would instead go with the momentum of where the defensive player wanted to go. In other words, if the person they were blocking wanted to go left, the blocker would let him go left and continue to push him in that same direction. In effect, this blocking strategy was setting up the defense to over-pursue, thus opening up a hole in the opposite direction. And Lombardi mentioned trading for Cleveland Browns defensive tackle Henry Jordan, who, while not the biggest, had the strength and speed to shore up the Packers' defense. Lombardi wrote that his teams didn't always have the fastest receivers, but they were good at reading defenses and running routes. He would also see how physical a new receiver was. If they didn't want to block or were timid, they would never make it. Another thing Lombardi would do is observe how they ran routes over the middle and how they dealt with being hit. He'd watch how the receiver would get up after a big one to see if they exhibited signs of physical and mental toughness, and if they did, he knew he found a good one. July 28th. Running back Ferguson was traded to the Steelers, resulting in extra attention being brought to fullback Jim Taylor. As mentioned previously, for the first full day of practice for the entire team, the exercise was strenuous, and Lombardi ordered sprints of 10, 20, and 30 yards in the morning and afternoon, and he made several players run a lap around the field after practice for not exerting themselves enough in those sprints. Dale Titek, a former Packer player, watched on and remarked that the Packers hadn't run like that in 5 years. Lombardi himself stated they had a bad first practice. His voice had grown sore from yelling, though, so he couldn't properly tell the team his thoughts. During practice, Jim Ringo would go down with a leg injury. However, this would not be serious, and as noted by Pro Football Reference, he would go on to start every game for the 1959 season. Years later, in the book Lombardi and Me, Fuzzy Thurston and Max McGee were interviewed together about the early days of Lombardi. I'll quote a small portion of it now. "I've got to tell you one story. When I got traded to Green Bay, it took me 2 days instead of 1 to get there. I was late. I walked into the locker room and ran into Lombardi. 'Who are you?' he said. I told him, and all he said was, 'You're late. Get on the field.' I was scared of him. It was because of Lombardi that we were all so close. Winning brings you close together, and he taught us how to win. He couldn't lose. He was a great coach. He could have taken an average bunch of guys and won with them. Do you think we were average? No, I think he turned fairly good players into great players. Look at Bart Starr. I doubt he would have been anything but a good football player at best without Vince. Bart was mentally tougher than any SOB you'll ever see. Vince changed everybody's attitude. We couldn't wait to get back into training camp every year because we knew we were going to win another championship. For that first week of training camp, Jerry Kramer was roommates with Jimmy Taylor. The curfew was 11 p.m., and they found out just how strictly Lombardi took it when he saw Taylor sitting on his bed. He fined Taylor $25. To Lombardi, curfew meant not only being in your room, but having the lights off and being in bed. Even though Kramer knew Lombardi took this seriously, he, Dan Curry, Fuzzy Thurston, and defensive back Jess Whittington decided to sneak out one night. They were able to leave St. Norbert's pretty easily, where they ended up at a bar in Green Bay. After having a few drinks, in came assistant coach Red Cochran. Kramer hid behind the bar, Thurston and Jess ran into the bathroom, and Curry crouched down, not knowing where to go or what to do. Curry finally thought to himself that Red Cochran was a good guy and he wouldn't tell on them, so he went up to Coach Cochran and said hello, which led to Kramer getting up from behind the bar and Whittington and Thurston coming out together from the bathroom. Cochran seeing all these players suddenly coming out hiding like clumsy ninjas must have really surprised him. He looked at the group and said, "Couldn't you guys have picked another spot? What the hell did you have to come in here? Why did you have to pick my place?" Cochran looked upset and said, "I'm going to leave here and I'm going to come back in 20 minutes, and I don't want to see any of you here then. If I do, I'm going to have to report you." The coach left and the players were about to leave when Curry naively said, "Old Red will never tell on us. Good old Red." While Cochran came back upset and even more disappointed, and he proceeded to chase everyone out the bar. The next day, around noon, they were in their dorms, all wondering if Coach Cochran had said anything. Then they suddenly heard footsteps. Lombardi's voice yelled, Thurston, what in the hell are we going to do with you? Are you crazy or what? What in the hell do you think we're running here, a country club? That'll cost you $100. Kramer and Curry then heard the footsteps approaching them. Kramer, you gotta have your nut checked, mister. That's $100. It wasn't over for them, though. At the end of practice that day, Lombardi shouted, "You 4 guys come over here. You 4 guys who broke curfew, come here." They all came over. Lombardi continued. "Start right here on the goal line and go down the sideline to the other goal line. Then go across the end zone, up the other side of the field, and back to here. And I want you to play leapfrog all the way." Thurston contested, "What?" Curry answered too. No." Lombardi commanded, "Get down and start doing them." So they proceeded to play a game of leapfrog together all over the field. All the players were decent at it, except Thurston, who had trouble getting over the other players' backs and kept on falling over, leading the others to start laughing. On top of this, a whole bunch of fans saw this as they had stopped by earlier to watch practice. July 29th. It was reported in the Green Bay Press-Gazette that Lombardi was putting an emphasis on the passing game via passing drills. 7 players were cut, and the number of quarterbacks were brought down to just 4, with those being Bart Starr, Bay Pirelli, Joe Francis, and Lamar McCann, and it was noted that Francis was also doing some halfback duties while at practice. One highlight was Butler's speed. On one play, it looked like McGee had Butler beat, but then he was able to catch up with him. And here's something you will never hear in modern times. Butler was talking about the last time his speed had been timed by coaches. Take a guess at how long he had been. His senior year in college? His freshman year in college? No. The last time Butler was timed was when he was a freshman in high school. So back in the 1950s, it was possible to play football in college and not have anyone bother to time you even once. It didn't happen again until he was in training camp in his rookie NFL season. That is just insane to me. And in case you're curious, Butler ran a 10.4 in a 100-yard dash. The scrimmage that day was filmed and would be looked at later. Starr himself said he threw an interception in the scrimmage, which led Lombardi to say, "One more like that, and you're through." Not surprisingly, no mention is made in the article of Starr throwing an interception, as this was just a scrimmage, but apparently quarterback Bob Webb did even worse, as he would be cut following this practice. July 30th, Tim Brown, a halfback out of Ball State, came out ahead as the fastest one in the 40-yard dash. He ran a 4.75. That's right, the fastest player on the entire team ran a 4.75. Brown would later go on to Philadelphia in 1960 and be a 3-time Pro Bowler. In terms of how fast the other players were, Jerry Kramer was faster than Forrest Gregg, Fuzzy Thurston, and Willie Taylor. Nate Borden topped the defensive ends, and Des Koch and Dan Curry tied for the fastest with the linebackers, although no times were given for any of those players. July 31st. The previous Thursday night, middle linebacker Bill Forrester and center Jim Ringo were named co-captains of the team by Lombardi. They would collect all fines, set up entertainment for the team, and act as a go-between them and the coaches. Lombardi also named a 6-man committee that would deal with player problems. These would be Dave Hanner, Bart Starr, Forrest Gregg, Emlyn Tunnell, Bill Forrester, and Jim Ringo. Also, a 5-minute scrimmage was held. Before Lombardi came to Green Bay, Gary Knaflic had been playing as a flanker. However, that first week of camp, Lombardi approached him. "How much do you weigh?" Knaflic responded, "About 225. Lombardi said, "You're going to play tight end." Knaflic jokingly answered, "Coach, I haven't hit anybody in 5 years." Lombardi gave him a cold look. "Where would you like to go?" Knaflic realized that he needed to back down and said, "I want to stay right here, Coach." So Knaflic worked hard to build up his strength for the change in position. On the subject of blocking, he said, "I would bite, hold, do anything I could. I feared Lombardi more than any defensive end or linebacker I ever played against. I only had to deal with those guys once or twice a year. I saw Lombardi every day." August 1st. 12 players had now been cut. Lombardi gave his thoughts on his first week in practice. "We were able to get in lots of work, and we got real good effort from everyone, and that includes the veterans. In regards to the passing game, he said it was slow coming around, but that isn't unusual at this stage of practice. Lombardi assigned 1 lap for each drop pass by a receiver. While defensive back, Hank Grimminger dropped one, leading him to run a lap, but from that point on, there were no more drops." Speaking of Grimminger, he would run a 4.75 in the 40-yard dash, beating out Brown that day, who only ran a 4.8. In that day's scrimmage, Starr would lead a squad on a 40-yard touchdown drive on 6 plays. He completed a short pass to Horning and took it 12 yards. Jim Taylor then ran for gains of 2 and then 6 yards, and Horning then ran for 3 more and a first down. Don McElhaney ran for no gain, and then Starr threw a pass to the right sideline to Max McGee for a 17-yard touchdown. August 3rd. On the previous Saturday, the Packers held a scrimmage before 4,000 fans. It was also announced that an inter-squad game would be held on Saturday, August 8th. The team would be divided up into two teams, the Blues and the Whites, with Phil Bingston and Bill Austin coaching the Blues, and Norm Hecker and Red Cochran helming the Whites. Lombardi and Fears would oversee it. Starr didn't have as good of a showing in this match, as when he started from the 50-yard line, he was able to take it to the 20, however the drive stalled. And as mentioned in part 2 of this documentary, here we see an ad for the buffet-style chicken dinner where fans could attend and meet the Packers. August 4th, more information is given on the inter-squad game. A change was announced as the rookie coaches wanted to go at it alone, so Hecker and Austin would be coaching the Blues, while Bingston and Cochran would head the Whites, with Bart Starr and Lamar McCann being named the quarterbacks for the White team. Tickets would be $1 per adult and 25 cents per child. Also on August 4th, more details about the upcoming dinner were given, where fans could meet the players. This was the first such kickoff dinner in the Packers' history, and to put things into perspective, the Packers, who were formed in 1919 and joined the NFL in 1921, were just 40 years old at this time. Lombardi would be slated to give commentary and a highlight video of the 1958 NFL Championship game, a game in which he helped to coach as he was an assistant with the Giants. August 7th. It was mentioned that the Packers scored the fewest points in the NFL in 1958 with just 193, so perhaps it was appropriate that the Packers had a series of goal line drills. During these drills, the ball was placed on the 5-yard line and the Packers had just 2 plays to score instead of 3 or 4. And this article provides clarification on what it meant by the phrase non-league games. Here it simply refers to preseason games as opposed to regular season ones. Earlier in this series, I was confused by this phrase because during this time period, the NFL did play teams from the Canadian Football League from time to time. Also on August 7th, it gave more details about the upcoming dinner. Lombardi said the players would be given name tags, and he didn't want them all grouping up into one corner of the room, so he would handle where they sat. However, Lombardi himself would be separated from the fans by sitting at his own table. August 8th. More information is given on the inter-squad game, which would be played that day at City Stadium. The offensive starters would be on the blue team, and the defensive starters on the white. Players would be in their normal positions, and it would feature a mixture of both veterans and rookies. The game would be filmed, and a number of cuts would be made based on player performances, so this was a very important match for many people, as this was a do-or-die situation. As an example, the Packers still had 4 quarterbacks as shown in this pick, and one of them would be leaving the team. August 10th. So 11,566 fans show up to see the inter-squad game and notice an immediate reversal in how the offense looked. They scored 4 touchdowns, had over 5 yards rushing per carry, and had around 8 yards per pass attempt in a 28-7 victory over the defensive starters. And you can see from these and earlier photos, the Packers were wearing their old style of uniforms similar to 1958. So if you ever see any photos or video that claims it's from Lombardi's first week or 2 of training camp, and the normal green and yellow uniforms are shown, the description is inaccurate. Those uniforms would be debuted at the start of the 1959 regular season. In fact, here's a graphic from the Gridiron Uniform Database website that shows a side-by-side comparison between the uniforms from the 1958 season, the 1959 preseason, and the more familiar 1959 regular season. As far as scoring goes for Bart Starr's blue team, and produced the first score with an 8-play, 85-yard drive. It started with Don McElhaney rushing for 14 yards and Horning for another 14. 6 plays later, Starr faked a handoff and threw the ball to Horning, who caught it on the 15-yard line and raced in for the score. For the game, Starr completed 6 out of 8 passes for 93 yards, 1 touchdown pass, and no interceptions. The blue team would later add more touchdowns, with Luke Carpenter scoring in a 16-yard run, Williams catching a 3-yard pass for McCann, and Brown scoring in a 29-yard run. Reflecting on the game, Lombardi said he was happy from seeing the lack of offensive mistakes. The defense usually has an advantage, and they have a good idea of the plays coming at them, but the offense still moved pretty good. The weekend wrapped up with 7 players getting cut, which brought the roster down to 47 people, not including the 4 players who were away at All-Star camp.
August 11th. For the first upcoming preseason game against the Chicago Bears, Lombardi gave this prediction. I hate to think of the exhibition opener against the Bears. We'll be in a new system, and the Bears know theirs. We'll probably look terrible. I remember when we first started with the Giants. Same thing, only we opened against the Rams. It was terrible. Just the day before, on August 10th, the one-a-day drill started. Lombardi decided to do an on-the-field demonstration and audibles to the team by going up under center himself and telling the defense to switch around their positions as they pleased, and then he would call for the appropriate adjustment, pointing with his finger at the weak spots and saying to the offense, "It's a little early for that yet, but that gives you an idea." The new one-a-day practices would start in the morning at 10 o'clock and last until 12 noon. Then they would have a meeting from 3 to 5 and finally from 7:15 to 9 o'clock at night. August 12th. To prepare for the first preseason game, Lombardi put a special emphasis on stopping Chicago's offense. Packers end Buddy Mayfield came in pretending to be famed Bills receiver Harlan Hill, and Bart Starr was playing the role of Bears quarterback Ed Brown, and here's where the fake Ed Brown connected with a counterfeit Harlan Hill for a 40-yard pass. However, Bill Forrester was right by Starr when he threw it, so if that had been a real game, it was noted he probably wouldn't have been able to get that pass off. So what did Lombardi say at that chicken dinner? Well, we have a few glimpses. First, Lombardi addressed the fans themselves. "The confidence shown by you fans is the same confidence I hope rubs off on this football team as they launch their season in the National Football League." He continued, "This is your team. It belongs to the city of Green Bay. Without you, we can't do nothing. We need your help and support, and I can assure you that the coaches, the Packer organization, and the players will give you a team that you can be proud of in the National Football League." Lombardi's voice was said to still be hoarse due to all the yelling he had been doing in camp. And here we can see Lombardi at that dinner presenting 4 footballs to some lucky fans. August 13th. Lombardi announced the starting lineup for the first preseason game. For the line of receivers, they had left end Max McGee, left tackle Bob Skoronski, left guard Fuzzy Thurston, center Jim Ringo, right guard Jerry Kramer, right tackle Forrest Gregg, right end Gary Knafleck, and for the backfield they had quarterback Bart Starr, left halfback Paul Harning, right halfback Don McElhenney, and fullback Jimmy Taylor. Lombardi addressed the issues of his rookies in this game. They'll all play a lot because they all look like rookies today. In camp, Lombardi had a strategy of going after veterans whom he knew could handle it. For example, one day he chewed out Emlyn Tunnell and ordered him off the field twice for laps. Supposedly Tunnell was in on this though, as the two had been on the Giants together, and he knew Lombardi was using him as an employee to show the other players that even an all-star like him wasn't safe from his discipline. Bart Starr wrote that a popular misconception about Lombardi was he treated everyone the same, like dogs. But this wasn't the case. In fact, depending on how the player responded to certain types of criticisms and what the individual needed, Lombardi could have very different approaches. Take Bob Skoronski and Jerry Kramer. When Lombardi first arrived, he was all over Skoronski. However, he was sensitive and wasn't motivated well by fear, so Lombardi adjusted his strategy and tried to appeal to him through reason. Jerry Kramer didn't like Lombardi's demeanor either and even considered leaving the Packers, at least according to Starr, but he was eventually won over by Lombardi, and he stood as an example of someone who could take the verbal abuse. Sport Magazine made an interesting prediction prior to the season's start as to how the Packers would do. Last and probably least, that's a sad forecast for the once proud Packers. They got a good new coach in Vince Lombardi, but he might as well kiss this one off as a rebuilding year. Sports All-Star Pro Football Magazine also predicted the Packers would be last, and they would post a 4-7-1 record. Well, in reality, the exact opposite almost happened, although there were 2 things the magazine got right or close to right. 1, they predicted Green Bay would win the first regular season game against Chicago. And second, they predicted they would win 3 out of the last 4 games. In actuality, they would finish with 4 wins and 0 losses. So while incorrect, it was right in the assumption that the Packers would finish the season strong. Kramer remembered the impact Lombardi made. Everything he did helped. He was a master of organization, Every practice session had a flow, a crispness that guaranteed maximum benefits. He was a master of detail. He drilled and drilled and drilled to polish our special teams, our kicking and receiving units. He told us repeatedly that one critical play could decide any game and that we never know when the critical play was coming up. That's all for now. When we continue, we'll cover the 1959 preseason. See you next time.